housekeeping things about how we'll handle questions and stuff like that. And then I will introduce Ola, and then Ola will be chairing the session. I will just be one of three speakers. And the idea is that, well, actually, I suppose two speakers in a way, because Paul's coming in more as a discussant. So Sridhar will go, then I'll go, then Paul will make some comments. And then normally we have a really interesting discussion because we get quite interesting people in these sessions. So it's nice if we have at least half an hour's discussion. And we always finish no later than 4, sometimes slightly earlier.
Okay, we are live on YouTube. We already have attendees with us.
Oh, great.
I'm gonna start sharing screen.
Okay, thank you, Lucas. Well, why don't we kick off? So this is the 16th. I was hoping to do 19 this year since it's the year of COVID-19, but we haven't quite managed that. But it's the 16th webinar of the global platform on coronavirus and older adults in low and middle income countries that I know most of you are very familiar with. If you're not, that's the hyperlink to our website where we've got all our former webinars, blogs, and many other things. And this webinar is going to be slightly different to the previous ones we've done. Firstly, because I'm not going to say very much at the start. That's because I'm going to be one of the people giving a paper. So without further ado, I'll just hand over to Lucas, who will talk through a few little housekeeping points, and then I'll hand over to my good friend Ola, who will be this week's chair.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you all for participating of this webinar. As always, we were gonna take questions at the end of the session. And there are 3 different ways everyone can engage with us. There's a Q&A on Zoom. You also can chat with us. And also, we are streaming on YouTube. So if anyone wants to make comments, then I'm going to be looking at the YouTube session too. Ola.
Okay, well, thank you, Lucas. That's great. And so now I'm just going to hand over the reins to Ola Abu Al-Ghaib, who is originally from the Palestine and has been working as both an activist and a researcher and a senior global policymaker in the area of disability rights, with a particular focus, I guess we'd say, on low and middle income countries. She has a PhD from my university, which is very nice. She was the director of research for Leonard Cheshire International, and she is currently manager of the UN Partnership on Persons with Disabilities at UNDP. And I think it's great that we're being chaired by somebody who doesn't focus very often specifically on older people, because as I said to the other participants, the idea is that we're trying to open out debates into some broader issues this week. So it's brilliant to have somebody like Ola who's interested in engaging with us. Thank you, Ola.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thanks so much for the invite to be with you today. It's a very interesting discussion and very important and timely, actually, to raise more attention to the issue more globally. As we know that, this global pandemic have unfortunately widened even further the gap in terms of inequality for many populations. And what was really interesting also for me is that even it touched upon the whole globe. We could see that when it comes to certain groups and community members, actually the challenges and the inequality took place equally in all the communities across the globe. So that is really a very important thing to consider when reforming or recommending policies for governments to consider, or development actors, on what needs to be in place to reduce that inequality gap and look at the intergenerational justice that you are going to discuss and we are going to discuss in this session. Maybe before I introduce our distinguished speakers to share with us their perspectives and expertise, I think it's really important to also highlight that we could see also from our own work to support the countries through the UN processes during the pandemic that also on disability, it was really very frightening how the pandemic had affected the daily lives of persons with disabilities, because it had to do with the disconnection of the day-to-day access to services, but also it has put them on higher risks. And specifically when we are talking not just about children, but also adults and elderly with disabilities, because they were more disconnected to services. They were in many cases institutionalized, and institutionalization puts them at higher risk, but also more vulnerability when it came also to violence and isolation from understanding what's going on around them. So, as I said, the discussion today is really very timely, and it's really a very good moment because we know that not just the UN system, but more all the global actors are now considering what is called the recovery plans, socioeconomic recovery plans, understanding what needs to be learned from this moment beyond. And it's good to really see what needs to be in place with regards to that. So I will stop here and start with introducing our two distinguished speakers, starting with Siddhar Venkatapuram, who is the Associate Professor in Global Health and Philosophy at King's College London, who will start with us sharing his perspective, and then I will introduce my other colleague Peter to come in. So, Sridhar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, from wherever you are in the world. I'm really pleased to be able to have this opportunity to talk about intergenerational justice, but more, I guess, I'm really happy to be able to talk about the idea of the philosophical or ethical aspects of this issue and its relevance to what we are facing today and the choices that we have today. So I want to first thank you for the interest in being able to, or sort of interest in ethics and philosophy. I think that's one of the things that I'm sort of thankful for. Second, also, I'm going to thank you all for coming today, given that it's a holiday weekend in the United States. There's one example, but also it's the weekend and Friday, and so thank you very much for joining us. And also my congratulations to Peter and other colleagues for keeping this platform and these seminars going. It's been an extraordinary 8-9 months, and I was able to join one of the earlier sessions, and it was an extraordinary energy, and it was a really profoundly important time. And I think this platform and these seminars have really taken on issues that have been neglected for a long time, and I hope that there's much more to come. And so I just wanted to wish my congratulations to everyone involved in keeping this going. So Peter joked in an earlier email in my invitation that I'm not one for PowerPoint presentations. And that's not because, I don't believe in PowerPoint or anything like that. It's a disciplinary thing. I think that what happens is that, when we provide PowerPoint slides, usually people focus on the slides rather than what is being said. And I don't know if that's changed very much in Zoom, but I also think that there's no point in putting PowerPoint slides if my job is to use words to explain things. And so if I'm not doing a good job, I don't think the PowerPoint slides will do a better job. So I want to talk about three things, as is usual. It's always better to just talk about three things. The first is why intergenerational justice is of concern to people in the world today, or in sort of the phenomenon of the pandemic, just sort of the more empirical aspects of it. The second thing is that I want to explain a little bit about how philosophers and ethicists have been thinking about the concept of intergenerational justice. And third, I want to provide for you where I believe that these conversations have been narrow-minded or short-sighted because of the way that philosophers do philosophy. We sometimes get caught up in our own little debates, and we actually don't pay attention to what's going on in the world. And I will sort of try to point towards some things that I think as a result of this past year, but also just the concern for older people puts us in a position that we need to re-examine the way that we think about intergenerational justice. So I just want to then take the rest of the time to talk about those three things. So the first thing is that the intergenerational justice as a topic has become of interest to people because there seems to be a conflict between younger and older people with regard to the distribution of our valuable resources. So this seems to be the central idea that somehow, particularly during the pandemic, and we're now in our second waves, that there is considered to be a limited amount of healthcare resources, and these can be trillions of dollars or a few $100,000, whichever country that you're talking about. And in all cases, it's considered to be a finite amount. And the question is that should we be giving resources to certain groups over other groups? And what's happened is that there's been a tension because the way that we allocate healthcare resources, particularly in the richest countries, is based on particular reasoning that seems to go against providing healthcare to elderly people or very old people. And I will try to explain to you why that is and why actually in practice that actually isn't applied. So in one example is the idea that in health care economics, what we've been doing is that trying to find a way to best spend our healthcare efficiently. And the idea is that we want to make sure that we are using our social resources, whether through the tax system or through our contributions into private healthcare, that we sort of spend them well. And there's been many ways that people have tried to figure out how to efficiently spend healthcare resources. And there's been various kinds of criteria that are used. Now, one of the most understandable criteria is that whoever needs healthcare should get healthcare. And I think most of you would agree with something like that. Then there's also whoever needs or whoever has an urgency regarding healthcare, so they actually would die immediately if they don't get it, versus someone who has a great need for it. So there are sort of two different things. Then there's also this question about trying to ensure that whoever benefits the most from this healthcare should get that healthcare as well. And then there's also this other principle, which is that we should try to help as many people as possible with our limited resources. So philosophers have been going for a long time about all these different kinds of principles, but health economics and health economists have a particular favorite, which is that they should try to maximize the health from the limited healthcare resources that we have, so which that usually means in terms of benefit. So you might be able to save someone from dying because of healthcare, but actually if they were going to die a week from now or a month from now, then we probably would find it reasonable to spend money on someone else who might live a much longer time than the one week or 1 month, right? So these kinds of principles were the kind of background reasoning that were used earlier on this year when people were trying to figure out how to allocate limited amount of resources, particularly in ICUs and hospital sort of admissions, and they were making different kinds of judgments. But it also didn't happen in the hospitals, it also happened in the nursing homes. So what happened is that different kinds of decision algorithms were put in place where whether or not to send older people to hospitals was these criteria and the thresholds were changed, so that in essence, we now have a much more acute situation where before we might have been thinking about one person, but people started to think about many people and sort of saying, well, we should raise the threshold on the entire group of people in nursing homes or older people and sort of make those kinds of decisions. So this is where this idea of intergenerational justice might come in, because some people might be talking about age-based discrimination, and that's completely true, but this is a different concept, which is that the reason why we would be making those kinds of decisions is that there is this underlying belief that older people and then younger people, so there's some sort of balancing between the interests of the older people and the younger people in the world. And so the argument is policymakers were basically saying, you know, it's probably more beneficial for social decision making that we sort of try to ensure that younger people who who might likely benefit and live longer, have access to the healthcare resources than older people. So that's a generational trade-off that was being made, that somehow younger people should do it. But for people who are familiar with these debates or not, is that there's been a longstanding belief that in health economics and the way that we do health policy and planning, that that older people in essence have had their fair opportunity in life, and they've come to the end of their life, and that we should give younger people the equally fair opportunity at the game of life. And it's sort of called a fair innings argument, that we should be preferring sort of younger people in healthcare decisions in order to give them the equal opportunity at the game of life that the older people have had. So that's been what's been going on in the background. And also, if we were to think about what kind of intergenerational issues that were going on. So just to move quickly on towards the philosophical debates. So if you're not familiar with sort of Anglo-American philosophy or liberal Western philosophy, is that there's a strong tradition of what we call the social contract, which is that we have a hypothetical social contract in a society where all of us come to agree on doing and not doing certain things while we live together in order to pursue our lives and the kind of lives that we want to pursue. And in these kinds of social contract rules that are written or unwritten, we have a sense that there is different kinds of roles and responsibilities based on different kinds of age groups. So when you are a young child and you are an infant, there is sort of a responsibility not only at a family level, but also at a societal level, that you help these young human beings develop, that you make sure that they are given food, shelter, clothing, stimulation, safety, etc. So there's this responsibility about generations, that you want to make sure that the younger groups are developed into fully, sort of human beings, and they can practice their faculties and stuff. Now, there's also this sense that people in their middle ages should be sort of be able to support it in their ability to make their choices in life and how they want to live, etc. And then we are more and more increasingly thinking about older people as they live longer, about what sort of responsibilities do we have towards older people. And this is relatively a new concept in Anglo-American philosophy, because we have never really paid attention in theoretical terms to what happens when people live for a longer time, and all these different kinds of inequalities show up, and different kinds of imbalances and needs show up in older people. And so we're at the threshold of what's going on now. But now, if I could make this a bit complicated, what is it that they've not been doing, that the philosophers have not been doing, and even the people who've been looking at the empirical stuff haven't been doing? So a couple of things. One is that when we talk about intergenerational justice, we tend to assume that we are always talking about age-based generations. And I think that that's an important thing to think about, is that there's different kinds of generations, and it's not necessarily about 5 or 10 groups or something like that. And it's also not necessarily true that we're just talking about chronological age and what the older ones owe to the younger ones. It might be that the younger ones owe something to the older ones, right? So we can talk about rights and responsibilities and social obligations. So this is where it gets complicated, which is that in the world, different societies have different understandings about what the generational rights and responsibilities should be. So for example, in the background where I come from, in Asian cultures, there is a very high expectation that younger people are profoundly respectful of older generations. So the older you are, you actually get much more respectful, and no matter, even if you don't know them, you have to give them deference and expect that their wisdom and their sort of life experience is sort of valuable, and that you should show respect for that. Now, some would argue that that's not the case in sort of Western or Anglo-American societies, where actually, people who are older are seen to be less valuable, and it's the younger, working age, entrepreneurial, hardworking, income-producing individuals who are more valuable, and therefore that's the kind of way that it should always be, the focus should be on the young productive members of society rather than the non-productive older members. So this is something that I'm sort of making very simplistically, but I think that you would be able to recognize both of those things in both of those societies, but one society has more as well. But so when we make theoretical arguments, we have to be careful that we're not dominating the arguments from one particular perspective. And this is where it starts to get complicated. The other really important thing is that history has a really important part to play in the way that we think about intergenerational justice, which is that if one generation has essentially given up a lot in their quality of life, say, for example, fighting a war or going through a great period of austerity in order that future generations can have good quality of life. So this is a really important thing. Then we should owe them something in return for their sacrifices and their contributions. So this doesn't necessarily have to be, one age group. It can be one particular generation that's done that. So it might be argued that the millennials of today will be a generation that are sacrificing enormously so that the future generations can have good quality of life. And therefore, in the future, society owes something to the millennials of today for making that kind of sacrifice and contribution. So that's a really important thing to think about, is that this is not just a conversation about older people and younger people. This is about generations in a socio and historical context, and what each generation has done, will do, or is doing in the contribution force as they move forward to societies, I think. And I think there's no doubt that this pandemic is having generational impacts so it's having different impacts on different generations. And we should think about the ethics of the current situation, but also the future. And so lastly, then I'm going to finish by talking about future generations, or the generations that don't exist yet. So a lot of us think very much, and who are, some of you who are on this call are very concerned about people here and now, and the great injustice, particularly older people that are suffering around the world as a result of neglect, abuse, and poor thinking, and lots of other kinds of reasons. But we also need to think about the generations of people that are yet to come into this world and what we owe them. And this is a very difficult thing to do, and there's lots of quite interesting work philosophically that is being done, but not enough, and it's not necessarily thinking through all the different kinds of things. So people who are working on climate change have started to really think about intergenerational justice in terms of the generations that are yet to come. So what will the world be like in 100 years, 200 years, and what do we owe those people that are yet to be born? So I won't take up time now to talk about it. If you're interested, we can talk about it a bit later. But I wanted to point out that when we talk about intergenerational justice, we've still got the other issue about the generations that don't exist yet. And that's also an ethical responsibility that we have. So I hope I've helped a little bit in sort of spreading this conversation out a little bit more beyond the current here and now. What I've tried to do is sort of tell you what are the different kind of current ways that, way we think about intergenerational justice, particularly in healthcare, and what that was like in the pandemic and still going on. I've sort of told you a little bit about the social contract tradition and how we think about generational rights and responsibilities. And then lastly, I've told you some of the things that are difficult and we haven't thought about enough, particularly the global differences in the way that we think about generations, the way that history plays into the way that we think about certain generations, and also future generations. So thank you very much again, and for your patience and your still and your willingness to keep learning after all these months of crisis. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sridhar. That was really very, very interesting. And for me, actually, one of the key points that I carry out from your discussion, and I was reflecting on it while you were speaking, was the issue of how really massively the implications are when governments take decisions. Utilizing the existing resources has massive implications on well-being and life and death decisions, because that's really a very good example of what happened this year, of this immediate implication of a person being able to survive the pandemic and have this equal access to health services or not. And the other thing that I carry out from your discussion is also when it comes to disability, just reflecting on that, actually the line is very fine when it comes to age, because we have seen that for certain types of disabilities, specifically persons with intellectual disabilities, mental health issues. Actually, they were, even when they were young, there were very good concerns, even here in the US, about how they will be treated in the ICU, whether they will be prioritized, whether they will be actually being given that access, or they will be prioritization for someone else, with the assumption that how effective or useful or productive they are. It was really very concerning. Even myself, being a person with disability, I'm still very concerned. If I go to the emergency room, will I be treated equally because of the consideration that I'm a person with disability? So these are really big questions for us to think about when we're talking about the injustice and what needs to change in the health system to respond to that. Now I stop here, and I have the pleasure and the honor to introduce my colleague Peter Lloyd Sherlock, who's the professor of social policy and international development in the University of East Anglia, to provide us with additional insight from his perspective on the issue. So Peter, with no ado, please. Floor
Thank
is
you,
yours.
Ola, and thank you, Sridhar. And one thing I've learned already is that I don't. I'm going to try and avoid giving a talk after Sridhar gives a talk in a webinar, because he said so many interesting things. I feel like I need to largely rewrite many parts of my own talk in the light of his wonderful insights. Also, I am going to apologise shamefacedly for using PowerPoint slides, and I take on board what Sridhar was saying, and I do urge you to pay at least some attention to my spoken words and not just the written words. So I'll try not to have too many written words on the PowerPoint to achieve that aim. And I'm going to start off sort of being quite self-referential in terms of my own experience of the pandemic over the last 10 months. I've, like most people, just been working from home from this space here. I've been into my university campus just the once, effectively, and that was just to get a few things from my office that I needed at home. And all of this home-based working, I think, has actually had quite an important influence on my own academic outlook. Some of them positive, but in many ways, I think it's rather narrowed it and distorted it in a number of ways. And that's led me into some thinking which is framing my presentation today. And a large part of it is clearly that over the last 10 months, I've only really been engaging professionally with people with very similar interests, almost exclusively people who work on older people, mainly in developing countries, and obviously what we talk about most of the time is coronavirus. And, so through this platform, social media, various projects I'm involved in, other meetings with other organizations. And next slide, please, Lucas. And I think my outlook has begun to look a bit like this. So I Googled echo chamber, and this is one of the images I found. And I think this is basically me, this yellow figure, and within a very confined sphere of shared interests, you see this cycle of interaction taking place. The issue is that there is insufficient interaction between this echo chamber, for want of a better word, so we all retweet each other's tweets, we all broadly agree with each other about key issues, with the outside world and with other discourses and other echo chambers that are out there too. And I think I was always in a bit of an echo chamber, but that's very much been the case increasingly during the pandemic. In October, things began to change a little bit, and I had occasional Zooms with people who had a much wider set of interests as part of a Lancet group on coronavirus, a commission on coronavirus and social vulnerability in all its forms. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, we can skip. That's what it used to be like before I was in my echo chamber. I'd go into university, I'd meet lots of different people with lots of different ideas. We'd discuss, we'd drink beer, and so I had wider exposures than I have now. Next slide, please. This is how it felt like when I was talking to people in this Lancet group. I was still in my echo chamber, but I suddenly realized that all these other bubbles of echo chambers around me, each focused on a particular issue. all of which are, are arguably as worthy as the other set of issues, and everybody trying to relate those issues to the coronavirus pandemic. So groups on disability, indigenous groups, LGBT rights, people living in prisons. And I felt a little bit frustrated with that, because I'd come into this thinking that coronavirus has very, very specific effects which relate to age and to older people. And, I felt that my box, as I put in this slide, should be the biggest box, and there's other boxes should be rather smaller. But when I tried to put that case to my colleagues in this group, I came up against very fixed beliefs, strong beliefs, that whatever it was that they were focusing on should have primacy over other issues. And as we tried to put something together in a coherent way, it started to look more like a kind of shopping list or a tick box of groups and issues, a roll call of vulnerability in the oppressed, without any real coherence. And so I thought, well, firstly, I've got to try and find a better way to engage with these people, but also maybe I have to think about ways about framing these issues differently, so we can go beyond what's, I think, a very fragmented way of setting agendas and interests in global public health and in global international development. So for me, obviously, the starting point for this was to try and look at age in a different way, or a broader way than I would normally do, where I just focus on older people, however we define them. Next slide, please. And clearly, a starting point, as I acknowledged to my colleagues in this Lancet group, was, of course, coronavirus affects everybody. It affects people of all ages, greatly, and in multiple ways and in complex ways. These effects are usually different for different age groups. Not all of the effects are different. Some of the mental health effects are quite similar, but they do tend to be quite diverse for people at different ages and in different situations, be they frail, older people, young people in education, workers, whoever they are, of all ages. And of course, all of these effects are highly intersectional in terms of gender, disability, race, and many other things. But the point I was trying to make to my colleagues, and I didn't really succeed in making it, was that I feel that there is something special about coronavirus, which means that age, in its broadest sense, is the primary determinant of its direct and indirect effects on groups of people and on individuals. And I don't think this has been as obviously the case, or perhaps ever really the case, with previous major global crises and developmental crises. And so I think our structures of interests and agendas and ways of thinking about things were not very well prepared to take on board what to me was a fairly, frankly, obvious fact. And just by reading the newspapers, watching TV, it was very clear that the media and discourse more broadly was spending a lot of time talking about this, and was mainly framing it either implicitly or explicitly in terms of intergenerational dilemmas and fairness. And I think that's been the case in all the countries that I've been engaging with, not just high-income countries. So that was why I thought I need to think a little bit too about intergenerational relationships and fairness and justice, which I think is something that Sridhar's been thinking about a lot more and knows a lot more about than I do. But I thought I would have a go at thinking about this and how it relates to coronavirus. Obviously, to try and understand the effects of the pandemic on intergenerational justice and relationships, it's useful to look at how things were, more or less, before 2020. Next slide, please. And I think it's fair to argue, it's a big generalization, but it's fair to argue that there was a very serious and fast emerging crisis of intergenerational justice before the pandemic. And I think established understandings of, let's call it an intergenerational social contract, following on from Sridhar, established understandings of that contract based around education, reproduction, production, retirement, were under attack on lots of different fronts. one that this group's most familiar with, clearly the challenges associated with population aging and providing public services of different kinds. But clearly another one, which is, I think, accelerated perhaps even more than population aging over the last couple of decades, the challenge of declining access to secure paid work, partly due to globalization, but perhaps even more due to new technologies displacing the need for human labor. Big perceived and actual opportunity gaps between generations, such as access to housing, would probably be one of the most obvious ones. And also changes of both norms and practices relating to things like gender roles in different parts of the life course and family structures, making this established notion of intergenerational roles increasingly redundant and actually so redundant that it becomes an unhelpful kind of template. And again, linking into what Sridhar was saying towards the end of his talk, concerns about how current consumption, environmental degradation, etc., will affect future generations. And certainly when I looked around for stuff on intergenerational justice, most of it came out of this climate change agenda, which was quite interesting. So I would argue that the situation was deteriorating. It might be argued that this established view of intergenerational roles and contract had always been something of a mythic construction. And perhaps it was, but I think it was a very influential framework for public policy decision-making, for politics, and for discourse. And although the story here I'm painting may perhaps appear to be more salient in wealthy country settings, I would argue that many of these things are going on, maybe in very specific ways, in middle-income countries and even to some degree in low-income countries too. So I would say this is a general phenomenon. It's not a specific phenomenon to wealthier countries. And not surprisingly, and this is something a point Sridhar made, next slide please, the pandemic has played on these and has exacerbated these crises of intergenerational justice. And they're often framed in terms of impossible policy dilemmas that we have to make in the heat of the pandemic. Should we prioritize keeping schools open, keeping people's jobs safe, or keeping very vulnerable older people safe from infection? And at the same time, they've led to heightened discourses of ageism and also what you might call youthism, blaming feckless young people for their irresponsible behavior, spreading infection. So I think there's been a deepening and very unhealthy discourse of conflict between generations, often very stereotyped as well. And so it seems that there's almost a zero-sum tug of war between the generations that perhaps was emerging before the pandemic, but has become much more to the fore over the last few months. And this really, really, really worries me. I think this view of fundamentally conflicting interests between people of different ages, between different cohorts and generations, is deeply harmful in many ways. And I am concerned that it's going to very much contribute to a bitter post-pandemic legacy of social division. Next slide, please. Now, without wanting to completely spoil your day, I think we need to recognize that these issues will probably get worse rather than better in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. It doesn't take a genius to work out that access to secure employment will be even more scarce, partly because of the effects of the pandemic, which will last, and also because we've seen a tremendous acceleration of new technologies, making human labor inputs less required than they previously were. There will be less public resource to share. There will be reduced public expenditure. There will be perhaps higher taxation on certain groups. So these fiscal dilemmas will become more acute. There will be continued growth in chronic health and social care needs, not just because of population aging, which continues to accelerate, but because of things like long COVID and the very I think, very important long-term mental health effects of the pandemic, which I don't think we've really even scraped the surface of those issues yet. And of course, and quite rightly, there will be renewed focus on environmental degradation. So this really is, to me, a tremendous concern, which begs the question, what are we going to do about it? Next slide, please. And I think a starting point is to spend time talking to people like Sridhar, and we need to critically rethink what an intergenerational social contract even is. I think it was always something of a myth, but we all kind of, well, most of us bought into it, and it was a useful social construct to play along with. I think we have to develop a much more realistic understanding of intergenerationality. And I would argue that we have to have a particular focus on consumption within that. And I'll come to that briefly in a minute. In the short term, clearly, we need effective ethical frameworks to help policymakers resolve these acute dilemmas, these impossible dilemmas between schools and jobs and old people. And I don't think we have those at the moment, and therefore policymakers are floundering. And this will require, instead of being in my bubble or just talking to people who do the sorts of things I do, I think we'll need much more interaction between academics, be it moral philosophers, fiscal economists, behavioral scientists, to try and work out quite how we can come up with some insights which can help us through this, because at the moment I don't think we have them. That will be short-term firefighting. I think the ultimate aim will be to try and develop new ideas around generational justice, which can deal with these structural drivers of this crisis and hopefully support a less dysfunctional future. And I think our thinking and our theorization of generational equity, with the exception of some people working on climate change, is far less developed than our theorization on other aspects of equity based on wealth or gender or whatever it might be. And I think this urgently needs to be addressed. It will need, of course, political engagement and political support. I've got a short paper coming out in The Lancet next week, and I call for a United Nations Special Commission on Generational Justice, which sounds very grand. I don't think that's necessarily the be-all or end-all, and of itself, I don't think it would make a big difference. But clearly, this has to be a political project and not just an intellectual project. And they have to be working together very much as of now. And finally, and perhaps in a more positive way, we have to really celebrate and build on things that we do already that demonstrate and embody a shared community of interest across people in terms of various forms of diversity, but in this case specifically age, as opposed to a more individualized, self-interested approach to these sorts of issues. And next slide, please. Here's just one quick example of what I mean by this. Coronavirus, care homes. One of the main points of viral entry into many care homes has been, of course, through care workers, who often work on a part-time basis across many different care homes. When one care home becomes infected, these workers are the primary vectors taking it across to other care homes. These are mainly women. They often have no choice than to work in several care homes, since they're part of a low-status, low-paid, casualised workforce. Care homes prefer not to employ them on a full-time, formal basis. Many are immigrants from deprived communities. Almost none own cars. And so they travel from care home to care home on public transport, further increasing the risk of infection. They're afraid of being tested, since they may well lose their jobs if found positive, and they lack access to social protection. Most have large families of all ages. They depend on their income, and many live in overcrowded environments, which are themselves high-risk settings for infection. On the other hand, over the last few years, I've been involved in a program in part of Brazil, which is fundamentally based on a notion of a community of shared interests. It employs women from deprived communities, and it pays those women a basic wage to support family carers in very socially vulnerable families facing multiple forms of deprivation, containing frail older people. It provides those paid carers, almost all women, with training, and those women then liaise with health and social assistance workers in their communities to help make sure that these people are joined within wider infrastructure of service provision. The aim is to build the capacity of family carers, reduce the care burden on carers for older people, and it's provided what I would consider to be very socially useful paid employment for many women now for almost a decade, and it's continued to function safely during the pandemic. It's clearly improved the quality of life of older people as well as their family carers. It's provided a livelihood for the women who are paid through this programme. And the main thing we do when we present this to policymakers is we have evidence that it's reduced risk factors for unnecessary hospitalisation and emergency health service use. And there's a growing burden on the health system in Brazil of older people often needing health services which could have been better dealt with in home settings if they'd been identified earlier. Biggest cause of hospitalisation of older people in Brazil is untreated urinary tract infection. It's costing the country millions. So it saves public resources as well. So to me, this is talking to a model through which we can resolve intergenerational dilemmas. And I think, you know, it's nice to end on a positive note. I think there's a lot of talk about doing things differently about the pandemic. I think we have to develop shared agendas around consumption, be that with regards to the causes of obesity, overconsumption generating climate change, and societies where they decide to allocate a larger share of wealth to purchasing high-end motor vehicles than they do to social care. I think all of these issues are related within a wider narrative of thinking about consumption and justice. There's a lot of talk about doing things differently after the pandemic. It's hard to know how real those opportunities for change will be. I suspect the window for meaningful change may be quite narrow. And so I think we have to start thinking and interacting and influencing as soon as we possibly can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. It was really, really very interesting to hear your input. One key thing I also bring back from your discussion is the issue of, you know, how quick the policy decisions are into the daily life of people. And I totally agree with you on we can't ignore the fact that, you know, people with old ages were the highest hit, and we can't ignore this, and we need to understand more in details what really happened if we want to really make informed recommendations for the future. And then the example of how the day-to-day decisions in countries were around managing the care homes in terms of shutting them down or just locking the carers inside, or, you know, making all these daily tests, or is it just preventing them from being visited by carers? So there are so many implications that needs to be also understood, how that actually impacted them on daily living, which I don't think many have given that even any attention or enough attention, which we need to consider as well. So I think one of also the trade-offs, that there are some immediate responses that, because the pandemic didn't end also yet, we have to understand some responses are still to be made now. Even access to the vaccine, you know, to this second wave that we are facing. What did we learn from the first wave? What can we push even now to save the lives of those populations at the moment? So this is a huge responsibility, and I think we all need to collaborate around it. So it's a lot of for thought that we need to think about. And I'm hoping that today's discussion will bring more attention to the issue. Now I have the pleasure also to introduce our colleague Paul Ladd to provide us with his insights and reflections on the inputs from both colleagues on the topic. Paul is the director of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. So without further ado, Paul, I hand over to you to give us your insights.
Thank you, Ola, and thank you also, Sridhar and Peter, for really fascinating presentations. So I'm the director of as Ola said, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. It's based in Geneva. I am not an expert on issues of aging or intergenerational justice, so you'll please forgive me if my comments are crude or not well formed yet, but I wanted to contribute with three thoughts, and they are as follows. The first is around the interplay between the allocation of health and well-being and politics and societal values. The second is on intersectionality and discrimination. And the third is on the concept of an eco-social contract that UNRUS has been promoting for a number of years. So on the first, a lot of my anecdotal evidence is drawn, like everyone else, from the news every day. And I particularly follow the UK. That's where my parents are, that's where my children are. And on the one hand, it's clear that, as Sridhar said, the allocation of healthcare to older persons in the UK, the treatment that they receive through triaging at stressed hospitals, and the exposure that was given to care homes through the movement of older people with COVID into care homes and the movement of care workers in and out of care homes. But older people in the UK tremendously at risk. And therefore, there's a strong argument that they were less privileged and even discriminated against in the COVID crisis in the UK. I think when you look potentially more broadly at the impact of the broader policy response in richer countries, but also in the UK, the closing of schools initially, universities, the movement of universities to online teaching, the closing of bars and restaurants, the prohibition of certain types of indoor exercises, and the impact that those had on livelihoods and other health indicators across the whole population, I think there's actually an argument that that discrimination against older people did not hold across the whole population. And so the allocation of health services may have been strongly against older people, but the allocation of well-being will take many, many years to determine, particularly the impacts on the mental well-being of younger people, or people who lost their jobs, or people who lost some of their health because of other ailments which weren't treated because of the focus on COVID. And I think that is in part to do with, as I said, the interplay between, if you can, the technocratic allocation of health, how an economist would approach it in terms of disability adjusted life years or quality adjusted life years, versus societal values which also shape politics. So the incumbent political party in the UK is the Conservative Party. It draws a lot of its support from less metropolitan areas with a higher age profile among its supporters. And if you look at the allocation of fiscal resources in the UK in terms of pension locks, fuel subsidies and other support, then you could argue that actually the allocation of fiscal resources, and indeed through this pandemic, has been quite significantly oriented towards protecting older people. And also, when you ask young people what they care about, if you ask where a tax burden might fall, if you ask a young person who can't get their foot on the housing ladder, then they might argue for a greater share of opportunities. But at the same time, if you ask them about the health of their grandparents or older family members, then they clearly want them protected. So there's something I think quite significant about, it's not just the technocratic allocation of health, it's the broader allocation of well-being across a society. And it's also the interplay between societal values, how they treat older people, and also politics. I think that the second point I wanted to make was about intersectionality and different types of allowed or disallowed discriminations. This is ostensibly, of course, initially a debate around intergenerational justice. And yet it's not a simple plane where we're only looking at one factor, which is age. Discriminations play out according to people living with disabilities, to gender, to race, to ethnicity, to sexuality. And all of these present a much more complex palette of resource allocation from a technocratic side, but also discriminations and politics from the other side. So if we look at the burden of COVID across many countries, we did a survey in UNRIST on COVID and vulnerable groups. You know, the burden on care workers in homes, in hospitals and elsewhere fell disproportionately on women. You know, the burden of domestic abuse in households that were locked down fell disproportionately on women. The burden of loneliness because they could not access essential services fell largely on people living with disabilities. And so it's not just an issue of intergenerational justice. In fact, you can't separate intergenerational justice from a broader discussion around societal justice. And what struck me as interesting through the pandemic, that it was, you know, and I'm in a UN background, I've been in the UN for 15 years. So, you know, we, of course, our mandate is on human rights, non-discrimination and equality. And yet when you listen to media discourses on the pandemic, it's quite acceptable clearly to talk about certain types of discriminations, triaging according to age, and yet clearly unacceptable, and quite rightly so, to talk about triaging according to other vulnerability factors, whether people's lives may have been shorter because of certain types of comorbidities or disability, or indeed we know, unfortunately, through the empirical studies that people from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds tend to be affected more, and we certainly do not, and triage on that perspective. But ageism seems to be an acceptable discrimination when it comes to allocating health and well-being, and I think this needs more attention within the broader lens of societal justice. And the last point is around this concept of an eco-social contract. It came up in Sridhar's presentation, it came up in Peter's presentation. In my previous role in the UN, I was engaged in supporting quite extensive discussions on what people wanted in the next set of global development goals, what came to be known as the Sustainable Development Goals. And as in all political processes, we had lobby groups and advocacy groups coming from very many perspectives. We had youth groups, we had people representing older persons. And I think the lesson that I learned from that, and certainly as I continue to engage with the groups of older persons and aging in the UN, is that finding common cause and common ground in that advocacy was tremendously successful for them in terms of advocating for their needs within the agenda. So rather than competing and arguing for different goals and targets on youth or different goals and targets on older persons, actually finding the common substantive topics that both cared about and both wanted to see progress on was a much more beneficial way of actually seeing their needs reflected in the agenda. As we've seen the breakdown in the last 40 years of traditional social contracts in OECD countries, because I think largely of the economic policies we've followed and the individualism that has encouraged, we've seen other crises and challenges sort of ride up behind us, and Peter mentioned some. We have climate change, we have technology, which will impact the context for job creation in the future. And we think it's almost time, certainly in UNRIST, to encourage national discussions. I'm not quite sure if that contradicts Peter's proposal for a UN Commission, but certainly national discussions on what a new eco-social contract would look like, because it's clearly not now in the domain of allocating fiscal resources and opportunities and what the state does and the responsibilities of the citizens. It's clearly intergenerational in that citizens will increasingly and businesses will increasingly expect states to regulate on resource use and patterns of future consumption, production and pollution. And the best way of doing that to get common cause is through dialogue. And so, you know, this is not a universal blueprint. There is no eco-social contract. It certainly doesn't exist or won't exist at the global level. These are national level dialogues and contestations around how resources are allocated in the future. And the best way to do that is to bring people together to talk, to find common cause, and then to agree and vote in politicians who will deliver that for them. And that may happen sector by sector. We saw in the UK in the last few weeks that businesses were calling for greater regulation on deforestation, partly because of citizen pressure, but partly also because they don't want to be undermined by competitors who actually don't respect those regulations. And so whether it's sector by sector or issue by issue or coalition by coalition, we need to move towards a more communitarian understanding of how we live as societies within the boundaries of our natural planet and what we expect governments to do for us to help us get to that situation. So those were just three observations. I'm sorry if they were very crude, but one is on politics, how it plays with allocation. Two is on intersectionality and discriminations. And the third is on this concept of an eco-social contract.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul. I fully agree with you on the point also that we need to understand that there are the longer implications and the burden on the well-being of the communities overall, but specific groups beyond what was discussed on day-to-day basis, and definitely reflecting on the leave no one behind, and are we really considering that on a broader perspective to achieve social justice, because there is massive learning to get from the current situation more globally, but specifically targeted to certain groups. So thank you so much. It's been really very inspirational to get your reflections on the input. Now I would like to open the floor for questions from the participants. We have already 2 questions that were posted. Maybe I can start with those, and Lucas, please also let me know if there were additional ones I didn't capture. There was one to the panelists with regards to what makes, or what do you think would an intercultural account of intergenerational justice look like? So that was one of the questions. So maybe I start with that with colleagues to reflect on.
Hi, Ola. I think that question was specifically targeted towards Sridhar, and Sridhar certainly did talk about the importance of seeing these things within specific cultural contexts. So I will very happily allow Sridhar to respond to that question. And if I can think of anything that might helpfully add, or I guess Paul probably feels the same, I'm sure we'll happily chip in. But you made your bed, Sridhar. You have to sleep in it now.
So thanks very much. I think that it's a problem and a question that we should all be thinking about, particularly in this world of interdependency. We have to, one of the most important things is non-domination. And I think it's really important that we are very careful and more thoroughgoing in our ideas that we want to be determining in our discussions, deliberations, and global policies and agendas, etc. And so I think it's a really important thing. So I'm going to use this opportunity also just to respond to Peter and Paul, which I thought were both really excellent talks, and then also talk about this intercultural theory of intergenerational justice. So the first thing is that I just wanted to add on to Paul's discussion is that, you know, there is no doubt that things are complicated, that we need to think about intergenerational justice, we need to think about ageism, we need to think about intersectionality, etc. And so one of the things that philosophers do is that they kind of imagine only one problem so that we can actually think through what the implications are before we complicate it with stuff. And sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. And I leave it up to you about whether you think that we can think well by isolating one dimension versus the other ones. But I think that it's also important to acknowledge what you just said, which I'm talking specifically regarding Paul. And this also comes to this idea of intercultural or globally relevant issues, is that someone like Peter and I advocate for older people all the time. But what we end up doing is giving the impression or providing the impression that all older people are somehow socially disadvantaged. And this is simply not the case. And this is simply not the case in particular societies and in lots of other places. And so this might not be really good for politics to say this, but it's an important thing that for us to acknowledge in terms of theoretical stuff. So for example, as Paul was saying, in the United Kingdom, not everyone is property rich, but a lot of people in England and the United States have great amounts of wealth in terms of their ownership of property, which has actually made it impossible for younger generations of people to own property. So we would not think of them as being socially disadvantaged when they have significant assets in their stuff. But then, we also think about biological vulnerability. But the underlying assumption is that somehow older people get weaker as they get older, and this is simply not true, which is that we see a gradient in health inequalities among older people as well. And it's a very steep gradient, which means that the richer older people are much healthier than even younger people. So it's a really important thing for us to think about, which is this idea that while in general we want to talk about generational equity, one of the things that we can err on is to clump a great amount of diversity within a group into thinking about this stuff. So I think it's a really important thing to think about, is that in a place like India, for example, we can talk about older people being disadvantaged because in general, women who are older systematically, whether you're rich or poor, tend to be very socially disadvantaged, biologically also not doing very well, and then socially as they get older, they get more and more stuff. But you can't say that about older women in other countries as well. But it depends on what's going on. I think that's a really important thing. The other really important thing is that I just want people to recognize that older men in the United States, particularly in political positions, are very advantaged. And not only are they advantaged, they're actually determining the quality of life of the rest of the world by their different kinds of policies. So for us to constantly think about older people as disadvantaged, in essence, we're not actually shining the light on certain groups of older people that are profoundly advantaged and actually dominating the quality of life of lots of people around the world, not only within their countries. So I think that this is a really important thing to think about in this complicated story. But if we were to just think abstractly about intergenerational justice, I think we would just isolate that and sort of say, what is it about generational issues that we want to think about? The intercultural theory is that this is just, I think one of the most fundamental things is that people assume that, and I'm just going to just add a little bit more to what I just previously said, is that people assume that if you are older, that somehow, or later in life, that somehow you are less likely wanting to sort of take social resources, or they should be given less social resources. And in fact, this has profoundly challenged particularly humanitarian contexts, where communities are telling humanitarian agencies, you've got it wrong. It's not the children and babies that we want to prioritize. It's actually the older people that we want to prioritize because they contain the history of our communities. They contain the culture and the cultural memory of our communities. So while global health practitioners are used to thinking about benefit and how saving a child will produce 70 years of life, and therefore it's more important or valuable or reasonable or rational to save a child, it's the actual opposite in terms of some communities that are actually saying the cultural memory, history, and practices that older people have are incredibly valuable to us. And so this is not a minor issue. This is a profoundly important issue. And I think that we need to do better at that kind of respecting the different kinds of stuff.
Can I just add a rider to what Sridhar was saying there? I think that final point was very well made. I'm sure it's not intentional, but it kind of almost creates the impression that there's a binary distinction between the global south and the global north in this sense. I think it's also important to distinguish between norms and repertoires in daily practice. And so, for example, if you look at social care, people talk about very different cultures of social care. Yet in every country in the world, the majority of care needs of older people are met by women living at home. you know, and that's just the same in the UK as it is in India. And what's different, interestingly, in a country like India is that there may be several women who may be the contenders to have that primary caregiving role because of higher fertility rates. There are more siblings and nieces, etc. And what's actually very interesting, the difference in India, it's always the woman, but the question becomes which woman and how is that negotiated? Which is, so I think we have to be careful in terms of looking at norms and practice. Norms matter and discourse matters. And there is a lot of truth in what you said, but I don't think we should essentialize that, because when you look at daily practices of intergenerational justice at the micro level within families and households, often it doesn't follow that.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. There's nothing that I would disagree with on that. In fact, I would further stuff. So, you know, I did some research a few years ago about looking at hierarchies within domestic households and Indian families and among women themselves. So basically the mother-in-law versus the daughter-in-law versus the daughter, and who's in the hierarchy and how you know, their life is impacted and their health is impacted by their position in the hierarchy, and how they treat each other as a result of that kind of position. So I think that that's an absolutely important point that you're making. But yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So we have another question from the audience in relation to what can be done in terms of policy and systems level to relieve the additional pressure that is usually placed on younger generation when the older generation in situations of crisis faces additional health and economical implications.
I'm happy to make a quick response to that, and it is very off the cuff. Clearly, we talked about the crisis of livelihood opportunities for people coming into the labour market. There's also a sense that perhaps the way in which we educate people is out of kilter with what we need. I think not enough attention is paid to the massive opportunities that social care needs create, but those are not reflected in the way we actually raise people and inculcate values of what's more or less important in society, in how we train people, how we ascribe value. So if you're a banker, you can get paid a lot of money. If you're a social carer, you'll be an underpaid immigrant. And then we say there isn't enough work to go around. Well, you know, there is if you're prepared to do that kind of work. So I think that, to me, of course, it's very easy to say this, but I think we have to start really quite fundamentally rethinking these issues.
Thank you, Peter. We have also another question that is stating, what would the panelists believe or think? Do they think we need a new generation of politicians, possibly a mixture of young and people to rule our emergent societies after COVID-19?
My quick response is it wouldn't be a bad thing. I don't think it would necessarily of itself make a big difference. I don't think Margaret Thatcher or Benazir Bhutto did a lot for massively improving gender equality in their respective countries when they were in office. But nonetheless, having more women represented in politics is an unalloyed good. So sure, why not? And clearly there is overrepresentation of certain groups and certain ages in politics, and that can't be good.
Great. I don't see any additional questions.
So Paul wanted to.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Thanks, Shrija. Thanks, Ola. I was just going to say that we seem to be increasingly moving towards a very strange type of politics, and having diverse representatives, you know, in our governments, our civil services, all our institutions, in fact, is clearly important to get a balanced perspective across different issues, different perspectives. but it's not enough. Possibly, it sort of reinforces Peter's response. Population filtered through popular media and filtered through social media is leading to quite polarized positions around issues. And I think the only way to have a healthier politics is to invest in the local and community-based institutions that can encourage dialogue and shared perspectives. And I think we're lacking those at the moment. And I don't have the answer for how you do it. But I think bringing people together to talk about important issues as part of a national dialogue on the type of society we want could eventually filter into better politics. But at the moment, simply having different representatives is probably not going to be sufficient.
Thank you. So, Paul, there was also a request from one of the participants, if you could kindly share a link to the concept of eco-social contract. That was one of the participants asking for that. As I said, I'm not seeing additional questions unless...
Ola, I think somebody called Ruth Niayo and also Penny Verasanto have raised their hands. So we've got some hand raising going on as well. I don't know if you can see them, and we could just...
Oh yeah, I can see too. So Ruth, do you want to base your question, or you would like to directly ask it to the participants? Penny, I saw you added a comment to the chat box, but also feel free to ask directly if you want.
Like, Ola, I can give Penny and Ruth, they can talk, they can ask questions directly if you like.
Yeah, I mean, if they would like to, maybe, yeah, because I saw Penny posting a comment, but yeah, maybe let's give Ruth the chance first. Ruth, please go ahead if you want to intervene. Oh, I can see Penny starting. Okay, Penny, go ahead.
Yes, I was very interested in the discussion moving about class, because in my view, a lot of intergenerational arguments are a distraction from the real issue of class. For instance, you know, BAME deaths are higher because BAME people are stuck in more vulnerable jobs where they're more exposed. And I don't think it's a biological issue. So let's ask this question, because this isn't the one that gets asked in these kinds of discussions, is that we pitch one age group against another in the intergenerational justice argument. But what isn't discussed is, are we talking about the people who've been privileged enough to survive? So can I have a sort of response to that? Are we just talking about intergenerational relations in terms of survivors? And what do we do about those who don't?
Thank you, Ruth. Peter, Sridhar, Paul. Yeah, Sridhar, go ahead.
Yep, thanks very much, Ruth, for that question. And I really want to sort of emphasize how much I agree with your question and also your concern and motivation for that. So there's 2 or 3 things that you brought up. One is this question about class and the intersection between class and intergenerational equity and justice. Then you also brought into this question around BAME communities, or for people who are not familiar with it, in the UK we call racial and ethnic minorities sort of Black and minority ethnic groups, so BAME groups. And so you said that they're socially disadvantaged and that's why they are affected more. And so I think that, you know, firstly, this is seminar 16 of a series, and we've been trying to, I would think, in each one of these seminars, focus on a particular issue. And this one is about intergenerational equity and justice. That doesn't mean that we haven't been focusing on class. It doesn't mean we haven't been focusing on gender, or we shouldn't do that. But I think that each dimension is worthy of kind of examining for its own sake and trying to understand its dimensions. So this is just me as a philosophy professor talking, which is that it's like we need to give each concept and each issue its due, and then also then put it into this kind of stuff. So then second, I want to address your real big concern is that it seems as though when we're talking about intergenerational equity or justice, you're assuming that we're talking about older people and younger people, not between the oldest people and the next generation below it. But let's assume that that's the concern that you're talking about. And then you are saying basically, well, the older people that are alive are essentially the advantaged ones that have survived a life history of different kinds of things. And so they're actually advantaged in comparison to the other older people that have died, or the other people that have died over the life course because of lots of social disadvantages and injustices. So therefore, if we are talking about intergenerational justice, what you're doing is comparing not comparing the right groups. What we should be comparing is the people that have not survived, and then the younger people as well. So I think that's a profoundly important point. But if we were to sort of break this down a little bit more and sort of look at the social gradients within each generation, I would make sure that we ask the question, are we erasing the people that didn't survive to make it into that cohort as we look at the comparisons between different generational cohorts and thinking about equity? What does this mean for retrospective sort of corrections, and what does this mean for future corrections? So there's lots of things that you brought up: race, class, the idea of life expectancy and who didn't survive. But I really encourage you to kind of really give us the sort of patience to sort of focus on the generational equity part of this, while also sort of thinking about all these other things as well. Thanks.
Can I just chip in there as well? I'm sure Paul will have some comments as well. But again, I'm in a kind of anecdotal mood today. And I just remember when I graduated from university, I was able to get a good job because the economy was very buoyant. The labour market was very buoyant, and I had my pick of a few different jobs. Within 2 years, there was a major economic shock in the UK. Friends of mine, a year or two younger than myself, when they exited university, they couldn't get good jobs. And because of the nature of recruitment in the UK, you'd go on what was called the milk round. You'd be brought in, graduate entry, career path. If you missed the boat for a couple of years, it was very hard to get back on it, because that was it. You had an empty space on your CV. They wanted people coming straight out of university. Now, the point I'm making is that it's not necessarily, when you talk about intergenerational justice, you would say, well, that was very harsh on these guys who just happened to be going through university a couple of years after I did. So I think we really need to broaden this out in so many ways. And again, following what Sridhar was saying, and the trouble is, I think sometimes, and I do this, we tend to look at intergenerational justice from very specific perspectives. And I think we all need to kind of really, at a much more conceptual level, think about what this issue of opportunities and distribution and consumption means. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Paul, any reflections on this?
Can I just add to that story? Sorry, if there's other questions or people, I think there's raised hands, but I just wanted to add. So I am a product of these kinds of incredibly generational shifts over just a few period of years. Every time I graduated from a university program, there was a recession. So every time, so I have no doubt that I am an academic today because of these, recessions that happened just right after. And it's probably my sort of great risk aversion that I think that if I got an academic job, I would definitely have work for a long time as opposed to some other industry or something like that. But I want to say that there's, a couple of things. One is that, even a sort of a couple of years, 1 or 2 years, this has affected my life very closely. But also people who are working on young people's life, sort of aspirations and opportunities. One of the biggest thing is unemployment for young people can be devastating because if you're out of work just for 1 or 2 years in those sort of key years of post-university, it has lifelong implications for it. And it's a really important thing. So this is the other flip side of looking at, actually, it's really important that we focus on young people who are just coming out, because if we don't get them into the system, then they're going to have problems. And then the third thing that I want to point out is what Peter was saying. The criteria that these milk rounds, as if people don't know and from other places, is this idea that recruiting in the university, where companies and industries who come to recruit for students to new hires, they have various kinds of events, and then they interview and select people into different kinds of jobs and programs. And what I want to emphasize is that these people, no matter how impressive their companies can be, are not necessarily using the best criteria as possible. So the next year, even though they know that, for example, this year they're not going to hire some more because of a recession, the following year they could, in fact, ask people from the year before to come into that round, but they don't. Because they're, this is too much work for them and it's too difficult for them, and so they just keep going on with their system. So that, to me, is a purely self-interested and efficiency and lazy criteria. If they had a commitment, they would say, we missed last year's recruits, let's bring them in this year to make sure that we give them an opportunity or not. And so that doesn't happen. A second thing that happens, which I personally have lots of experience for, is that even during good years, jobs are competitive. And they're very competitive for very sort of well-paying and well sort of, socially advantaged jobs. And so as someone who's been through these kind of stuff, is that those selection criteria can be unjust, right? So if they can't say your name, they say, well, I don't want to work with somebody whose name I can't say. So, your CV gets tossed, right? So there's lots of really unjust, inequitable things that happen in terms of the survivors, as someone was saying, basically, who survives this whole thing, right? So lots of things along the way determine who survives, who gets the socially advantaged positions and all this stuff. And what we're trying to do is sort of bring forward how all generations have different kinds of unjust, as well as different kinds of factors that impact how they experience their opportunities and advantages. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just cautious of time. I know that, Ruth, you had a question to us. So, Paul, would you have any quick remarks on this? Or, okay, so Ruth, do you mind contributing with your question to the panelists before we end?
Ruth, you need to unmute your microphone. You should be able to do that now.
Is that a legacy hand or is that a new?
Yeah, I'm not seeing any reaction from her. Well, yeah, no, actually, still it's Penny.
Is legacy hand a specific piece of Zoom terminology that people use, or did you just coin that, Sridhar? Because I need to keep up to speed with
So of the hundreds of Zoom conferences that I've now been, that's the way that people refer to,
Yeah.
After you forget to click it again to take it off. So that's a legacy hand.
Well, okay, if Ruth, please paste your question if you have anything still to share with us. So maybe taking the occasion that we have only a few minutes left, could I go back to our panelists? If you have any final remarks to close with to the discussion, would be great, just in 2 minutes. That would be appreciated.
So I'll say it quickly. I want to just sort of say thanks very much for this, but I also want to point out to people, we're at the frontier of this. We're just beginning to look at all of these different kinds of issues. People have been working on climate change, but they haven't been working very much on lots of other kinds of implications. Some economists have been working on wealth transfers and savings and different kinds of stuff, but we haven't been looking at health, particularly in different kinds of ways. So I welcome anyone who sort of wants to look at this forward, but I especially want to sort of offer my hand, is that I, as a political philosopher, I'm always looking for people who do empirical research around this kind of stuff to try to figure out how we can work together So I want to sort of say, please get in touch. And also I encourage you to, not get in touch, but keep doing this kind of work and moving this forward and keep us informed of what's going on. I think this is a profoundly important thing to sort of pursue in the future. Thanks.
Thank you. Paul? Oh, Peter, go ahead.
And I'll leave the final word to Paul. Yeah, I mean, firstly, I just saw a follow-up comment from Penny that arguing that intergenerational justice cannot be understood without class, without reference to class. Yeah, I mean, gender, class, there are obviously a number of things that one would want to consider. I guess, as Sridhar said, we were just focusing on intergenerational justice without losing sight of those issues. And my sense is that it has become more important. It's become more urgent. And it's an area which is very under-theorized and does not lend itself well to the current constellation of UN agencies, academic interests, NGOs. And I do feel that there needs to be a certain amount of template shaking up going on here. But maybe I'm wrong, but that's my sense. Other than that, all I'd say is, to people attending, this has clearly been a rather different session to the other sessions that we've had, where we often focus very much on practicalities and much more exclusively focused on older people and coronavirus in low and middle income countries. I actually feel that this discussion is incredibly relevant to those practical issues. What I haven't had enough time to do myself is to show those linkages, which is why I'm often referring to my own personal anecdotal experience. But I think if I can find those personal anecdotal linkages to not going into university, talking to people on the Lancet Commission, people who left university a couple of years after me, there must be very important relationships between these big, rather abstract ideas and specific policy dilemmas, interventions, etc., relating to older people and people of other ages in low and middle income countries. I just haven't figured them out yet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Paul, final remarks at your end?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. Well, first of all, I would like to say thank you. That's been really interesting. And it's quite interesting to jump into something where you've already had so many discussions on other aspects. And I think my comments was always much more complex than that. And you could turn around and say, yes, of course, we've discussed that. And now we're focusing on intergenerational justice. And I think it's encouraged me to read now more about the arguments and frameworks and approaches to intergenerational justice in its own right. That said, I graduated 25 years ago with a master's degree in econometrics, and economics is also guilty often of boiling down models and approaches to two variables that we can see how they relate to each other, and then we blow up from that system and we see if we can find policy implications, and we often do, and then we apply them, and then we wonder why people and the world doesn't react in quite the same way that we predicted. And the SDGs, for their faults but also their benefits, teach us that we have to think about systems and that the world is very, very complex. And so I sort of agree with Penny. You can't really separate out discussions on intergenerational justice without thinking of the overlay of all the intersectionalities around class, gender, disability, ethnicity, race, and possibly many others too. And I wonder if we need approaches that allow us to consider that complexity laid against what we understand about intergenerational justice. It's incredibly complicated. Even like I think about things in my normal research life about the relationships between land, water, the environment, and livelihoods, mini systems that you can sort of look at and you have data on. It's much more complex for horizontal inequalities and discriminations and things which people won't tell you about unless you can really pin them down. But I do think there's a role for complexity in here, and I think it's important to remember that we can't simply always just separate things off.
Thank you so much. I mean, I would like also to thank Peter for putting this out there and making this discussion very timely for further thinking and action. I want to thank the panelists for their massive insight on the topic, and I encourage the participants to continue to engage on the topic. And we look forward to the other discussions that Peter will share with us in the coming webinars. Thanks everyone for taking the time to be with us today, and have a lovely afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Enjoy